Welcome back to part 2 of our series on the Aztecs. Which should historians emphasize? Agriculture or human sacrifice? This particular discussion, we'll be looking at our documents, particularly our 5 documents relating to both agriculture and human sacrifice. Make sure when you're going through these documents and looking through them on your own in your packets that you keep in mind that you only can use one of these 2 topics. You need to pay attention to which documents go with which particular idea and how you can use those documents to help support what your argument is going to be in your essay. So without further ado, let's get working. Looking at document A, we can see that this is a map of what Mexico looked like as far as the expansion territories that the Aztecs did. Looking at the key, we can see that this particular map is looking at 6 specific Aztecs leaders and their ability to expand the empire and where those expansions took place. If you look on the far sides, where this gray area is, that's identified as areas as being unconquered territories. If you took a few seconds to read the note underneath the map, it kind of talks about the purpose of those unconquered territories as them being kind of deliberate. The fact that they didn't want to conquer everything because then they'd have to be allies with the people in those areas. Instead, they leave those areas purposefully unconquered so that in the future they could actually go and try and defeat the people and the tribes that lived in those areas. The benefit of that is now they have a new source of people that they can pull from for their purpose of their flowers, as they call it, or their people that they would use for the sacrificing. You typically didn't want to sacrifice people that were in your own empire because that just makes you look bad. It's kind of bad form in order to do that. So if you go and conquer a different area and take those tribesmen, those people as prisoners, that's not as bad because they're not your people. So they would purposely leave these outskirt areas unconquered. They would just pull from them from time to time, have little battles with the different tribes that are over there as an excuse to try and, or as a reason rather, to try and get those people as flowers for their sacrificing. A couple other things you can point out from this map is the fact that it's lasted, if you look at the dates, over about 100 years, a little less than 100 years, when you add up all of these different leaders that were able to conquer this territory. So 6 leaders getting all this territory in a little under 100 years. That's pretty impressive. But you also have to keep in mind that it's not as easy as just conquering these territories. You have to be able to maintain them as well. So the fact that these territories lasted 100 years up until its peak before things started to kind of dwindle down a little bit, there is some sort of organization or planning or government involved in this territory. So not only does this show us the area that was conquered, the region that was controlled by the Aztecs, but also shows us a little bit of other information that it was maintained. They were able to hold on to it through some sort of order. Our document B for our discussion goes into some agricultural reasons why we might want to use that as a possible answer for our DBQ response. There's 3 different types of resources or pieces of information in document B that you might find useful in helping you decide whether or not to use this as your reasoning to answer your question. The first part is the top. It's a paragraph written by Peter Stearns in 2001. It's actually a part of a textbook excerpt that kind of talks about what the Chinampas looked like. The fact that they were about 17 feet long by 100 to 300 feet wide. These massively huge frames made out of kind of a wicker or what do we call it? Reeds, kind of thick grass that was woven together to make walls to hold the dirt in and all the stuff. The fact that they would use these trees, these in the corners of these boxes and throughout different parts of the boxes to try and hold this frame into one place. The fact that this type of system was so successful for their agriculture, they were able to get 4 different crops per year of corn just from this agricultural system. For anybody that's into farming, you might not know that corn is actually a very difficult crop when it comes to the minerals required to grow it, that it takes a lot of nutrients and stuff out of the soil. So the fact that they were able to grow up to 4 different crops per year, that's pretty impressive considering the fact the amount of nutrients it takes to do that. Not to mention the amount of manpower that it would take to harvest 4 different groups or harvests of corn every year. The other 2 pieces of information that are on this page are actually 2 different drawings. The first drawing on the left comes from a manuscript that was written around 1542. So this is shortly after Cortez had come, about 20 years after Cortez had come around, and somebody thought it would be a good idea to kind of draw what these chinampas look like, or at least what the area looked like that uses these chinampas. So as you can see from here, you've got a main stream kind of going in a diagonal up the center or through this field, and then you've got these smaller streams that kind of go up and down and a little bit off to the left and the right as well to kind of separate the different chinampa fields. These chinampas, just by looking at this picture, you can see is a very large, very long, very well laid out system of agriculture. The fact that this is a planned system. These chinampas are not just haphazardly put anywhere. They're lined up, they're purposefully dug out in certain places for irrigation purposes. They have walkways to allow people to go up and down them easily, but still allow a lot of water to get to them. Because as we can see on the chart on the right side, or the picture on the right side from 1998, by Daily Life of the Aztecs, some magazine article that was done, that these chinampas were literally kind of in the middle of this lake. They were floating on top of these rivers. So being able to access them with boat, but still be able to use these narrow paths to walk on, was a pretty smart idea if you think about it. So they could get from one area, from one chinampa to the next quite easily, but still be able to have that water around it in order to provide that the water that it needs to grow these things. So that's very important to know. You'll also notice, especially in the picture on the right side, it kind of identifies exactly how the chinampas kind of looked. They were kind of rectangular shape. You can see that in the corner, especially in the one in the center, that these trees were anchored in the corners of these reed frames to hold these boxes together, and that the root system was able to go down under the water and into the ground underneath it in order to create a very strong support so that these reeds and these boxes wouldn't go anywhere. So using this particular document, we see a couple different things. The fact that they were able to create a well-organized agricultural system, planned system, but also that they were able to use or come up with their own ways of supporting it with boats, with small walkways, make it easily accessible, but still provide it with all the water that these plants need in order to be successful for a good crop. Our third document, we are looking at a mural that was actually painted by an artist by the name of Diego Rivera around the year 1929. This painting actually is housed in the National Museum in Mexico City today, where anybody can go and see it. He's actually a fairly good artist and known for his murals. But the point of this particular piece of art, and why we have it for our DBQ, is if you look at it, it's depicting the different Aztec people working on the chinampas, the fields. So here in the forefront, you actually see men and women both working on their particular jobs. So you got the men that are harvesting the maize or the corn, and you got the women that are rolling it into tortillas, which they would obviously use as part of their diet and their meals. If you also look closer on the left side and kind of towards the center, you do see a person dressed as the corn goddess. The purpose of this is obviously that, as we mentioned before, the Aztecs had over 128 deities. Those 120 being the primary ones, with a lot of other ones as well. So this person, this artist, is depicting the importance of not only agriculture in their society, but also the importance of their religion and how that relates to their agriculture. That they relied on religion, in their belief, to help with their agricultural needs. How could this document help us? Well, Rivera's painting here makes the Chinampas and their agriculture system come alive. He captures the large scale and the spiritual nature of farming. Aztec life for the common man and woman shown here has an order and dignity. You'll see that these people are willingly working for the most part. They are not necessarily slaves, but they are working together for the common good, for the success and survival of their people. So Diego Garcia wanted this picture to go out there and show others that their history is something to be proud of, that they have a long and proud history and an old history. And that is something that needs to be cherished and remembered. Document D takes us to the other option for us to consider for our essay topic. In this case, human sacrifice. Here we see two different pieces of information in this document that can help us decide whether or not to choose human sacrifice for our topic. The first of these items is the top paragraph written by a Spanish priest who actually lived in Mexico. This book is one of the earliest accounts of this Aztec tradition of human sacrifice. It was published for people to read around the year 1581. So he obviously was there, or at least knew about this practice before he wrote about it. If you remember, the Spanish conquistadors had come around 1519. So within the difference of years, we're talking about 60 years, this guy was probably there and saw some of the stuff that was going on, or at the very least was familiar with it just by the stories that the Aztecs told. So this paragraph specifically talks about the process that they did with the ripping out of the hearts and the tossing or the rolling of the bodies down the stairs. This particular account talks about one day in particular where the sacrifices started around early afternoon, noontime, lunchtime, and they lasted up until nightfall. According to him, he had counted 2,300 men that had been sacrificed on that day alone. So we can kind of see that this was a big deal, that they're willing to sacrifice thousands and thousands of people for whatever their purpose is with these sacrifices. As we sort of know, and we've talked about earlier, these sacrifices was part of their religion to the sun god and his need to be nourished with the hearts and the bloods of these tributes. So we kind of get a visual here, at least in our heads, if not by this picture, which we'll talk about in a second, on the volume of bodies, the volume of tributes and people that were sacrificed, the amount of gore, and how big of a deal this must have been for them to be able to be sacrificing this many people just in one day. Now imagine them having to do similar sacrifices throughout the year. How many thousands and thousands of people do you think they had to come up with in order to appease or make the sun god happy? Okay, we're talking a lot of people, which means they'd have to go outside of their territory, as we talked about in document A. They'd have to do pull in lots of prisoners in order to do that. So some voluntary tributes, things like that, which we'll talk about in our next document. So massive amounts of killing and sacrificing for their sun god in particular. The second piece of evidence comes from 1542 codex that we know as the Codex Mendoza, which was commissioned by a Spanish viceroy of Mexico in 1541. You don't need to know much about that. But basically, it illustrates or draws a picture of the process of this ripping out of the heart and the tossing the bodies down the stairs. It kind of just puts a visual to the paragraph we kind of saw just above. How does this help us decide whether or not we should worry about this for emphasizing it in our essay? Well, again, the sheer volume that they were willing to sacrifice thousands of people, that there was a dark side to this culture as well. They might not have seen it as a dark side necessarily, but with all cultures, there's positive things that we see and there's negative things that we see. And it's all how historians document it, how they present it. Do we want to present this as a negative thing, something that should be frowned upon as far as the Aztec history, or just something that's part of their culture, not as a negative thing, but just as a fact that they did this? That this slaughter was not for entertainment, that it was for religious purposes, which might take some of the edge off, I guess you can say, of the practice of human sacrificing. So these are all kind of things to consider when deciding whether or not to choose sacrificing as your topic of choice for this essay. Our fifth and final document, Document E, also takes us into the idea of the importance of human sacrifice at a more personal level, a more individual level, as people would use sacrificing and have it as part of their day-to-day life. This particular excerpt comes from a friar, so somebody of a missionary kind of job, Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, from his Florentine Codex number 2, which was written around 1555. In here, we can see, and I'm just reading the notes right off of the document here, that he interviewed this 17-year-old boy who kind of discusses the idea of some of these tributes or people that were going to be sacrificed and how that worked. He interviewed this person sometime after 1529. So somewhere between 1529 and 1555 is where he interviewed this person to kind of get this 17-year-old's idea of the sacrificing and that it wasn't just done haphazardly, that there was a purpose to it, a real religious and sacred process by which this occurred. And in this document, we actually have the 17-year-old talking about the fact that they wouldn't just gather these people necessarily after they've defeated them and just throw them up on the temples and rip out their hearts and toss them down the stairs. Some of these guys were actually, there was a process involved. This particular account talks about the process of making this enemy warrior who had failed or who had lost in his battle, but transforming him into an actual god. Okay, this idea of a god on earth might sound familiar if you're a Christian. Okay, but they take it a step further. They don't just say, "Oh, you're a god." No, this person has to get brought into that. As a god, you have to be considered perfect. Perfect in beauty, perfect in food. You have to be treated perfectly. So this document or this transcript talks about how this person is treated. He has his own entourage or his bodyguards that are there to protect him. He gets to walk around town and everybody is just looking at him in awe and wonder and how massively beautiful he is, how amazing he looks, that this God on earth is the perfect being that people might want to desire to be. The fact that the women would want him and were just totally devastated when he would end up being sacrificed. So again, this whole process in this document is talking about the process before he's being sacrificed. The preparations that they took to make this person as godlike or God as possible, because that's who he was going to represent or who he was going to actually be. Now, why do we need to worry about it if you're going to choose human sacrifice? Well, this was a ritual. Again, this isn't something that they did haphazardly. They didn't just pick this guy out of the street and said, okay, off with your heart. No, there was a ceremonious, religious, deep reasoning to their faith. That this wasn't done as punishment, that this wasn't done as some way to get back at the enemy, but it was done in order to satisfy the gods. That they needed their nourishment, that they needed recognition, and that the people down here, if we needed what the gods can offer, we have to give something, an offering to them. So keep that in mind when you're deciding this as a possible reason for your topic. So we're done with our 5 documents. That wasn't too hard, right? Now comes the easy part. Trying to figure out which one you're going to choose. Agriculture or human sacrifice. Remember, you need to be kind of balanced and fair when it comes to deciding which one you're going to choose. But remember, you need to stick to one of those 2 choices when you're writing your essay. Please don't say that you choose sacrifices and then flip-flop halfway through and say that agriculture was important too. Okay? You need to defend one and only one throughout your argument. You are going to mention the fact that there's another option, but through your 3 paragraphs, you're going to defend the one that you chose. So stay tuned for our next video where we're going to kind of go point by point as far as the chicken foot is concerned and look at some examples and ways that you can consider writing your thesis statement or things like that in preparation for working on your draft and your final copy of your essay. So, now that we're all done with the documents, I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day.